My name is Taylor Hernandez. I'm 32 years old now, but the moment everything shattered still feels like it happened yesterday. Growing up, I was taught that family comes first. No exceptions, no questions. Blood is thicker than water. Right? That's what I believed when I married into the Hernandez family and poured 8 years of my life into our small marketing agency in Germantown, Tennessee. I thought hard work and loyalty would earn me a permanent place at the table. I was wrong. The annual family gathering was always the same barbecue in the backyard, kids running around, and at some point the conversation shifted to business. That day, in the middle of the agenda, my older brother stood up. He looked straight at me, cleared his throat, and announced the organizational changes he had decided on. His voice was calm, almost casual, like he was discussing the weather. He was letting me go from the family company, effective immediately. No warning, no private discussion. Just like that, in front of our parents, my sister-in-law, and the rest of the team, I was fired. The room went completely silent. Everyone waited for the reaction, the outburst, the tears, the argument. Instead, I met his eyes, nodded slowly, and said, "Okay, I accept." The shock hit like a wave. My brother's face tightened. My mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. My sister-in-law blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply gathered my notes, stood up, and walked out the door. What they didn't know, what no one in that backyard realized, was that I had seen this coming for a long time, and I was already prepared. The very next day, my phone started lighting up. Calls from my brother, voicemails from my parents, texts from my sister-in-law. They were all saying the same thing: come back. The company needed me. They couldn't manage without me. Their voices were urgent, almost panicked. I listened to one message after another. Then I sent a single reply. One sentence. That sentence left them pale. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, or wondered what happens when the person they thought they could control finally walks away, stay with me. This is the full story: how I went from being the one they could replace to the one they couldn't afford to lose. Hit that like button if you're ready for some real family drama. Subscribe so you don't miss how it all unfolds, and let's get into it. When I started at the agency 8 years ago, it was still a small operation run out of a converted office space in Germantown, with just a handful of employees. I began as a junior marketing coordinator, but quickly moved up to senior marketing lead because the results spoke for themselves. In my first full year, I secured 3 major contracts for local real estate developers that brought in over $500,000 in new revenue. The following year, I closed another 5 deals, including a long-term campaign for a chain of regional restaurants that increased their online engagement by 60% and boosted foot traffic enough to justify a second location. Over time, I brought in more than 10 high-value clients, each one requiring detailed strategy sessions, creative direction, and ongoing client management that no one else in the office had the bandwidth to handle. The numbers were clear under my leadership on these accounts. The agency's overall revenue grew by more than 50% in 5 years. I wasn't just meeting targets, I was creating growth that the business had never seen before. I handled everything from market research and campaign planning to vendor coordination and performance reporting, often working late to refine pitches or troubleshoot issues before they reached the client. The awards started coming: 2 local marketing association recognitions for best campaign execution and highest client retention rate. I took pride in that work because it felt like proof that dedication paid off. My older brother, Brandon Hernandez, 35 years old, and the CEO, had taken over day-to-day leadership from our parents a few years earlier. He was good at the big-picture vision and networking with local business owners, but the operational details and client-facing execution often fell to me. Our sister-in-law, Jana Hernandez, served as operations director and managed internal processes, scheduling, and team assignments. My parents, Joe and Ann Hernandez, were the founders who still held advisory roles and had the final say on major decisions, though they rarely interfered in daily operations. At first, the collaboration seemed smooth. We had weekly team meetings where everyone contributed ideas, and my proposals were usually adopted because they aligned with what the data showed would work. But over the last couple of years, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. Brandon began dismissing my suggestions during meetings with comments like, "That's one way to look at it, but I think we need something more aggressive," even when my approach was backed by previous campaign metrics. He would then present a slightly modified version of the same idea as his own in the next client call, receiving praise, while I sat quietly taking notes. Jana played a role too. She would assign me the most time-consuming administrative tasks, compiling detailed reports or chasing down vendor approvals, while taking credit for the successful outcomes in her updates to the senior team. When I raised it privately, she smiled and said, "We're all on the same team, Taylor. Credit is for the company, not individuals." The passive-aggressive tone became more frequent remarks about how some people are great at landing deals, but running the day-to-day requires a different mindset. Or, "We need leaders who think about the whole family business, not just their own accounts." I tried to brush it off as stress from growth pressures. I kept delivering results quarter after quarter, convinced that consistent performance would eventually outweigh any family dynamics or ego issues. I focused on the clients, the numbers, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was the reason the agency was thriving. What I didn't fully grasp then was how those small slights were laying the groundwork for something much larger. A few weeks later, the annual family gathering rolled around, which, as always, doubled as the quarterly business review. Everyone gathered in the backyard of my parents' house in Germantown, the same spot where we had celebrated milestones for years. Tables were set up under string lights, food was laid out, and after the casual catching-up portion, the conversation naturally shifted to the agenda items my brother had prepared. He had sent out a short slide deck the day before, titled "Organizational Updates," and the mood felt routine until he stood up to present. Brandon walked to the front, clicked through the slides, and reached the page labeled Team Structure Adjustments. He paused for a moment, looked directly at me, and said in a measured tone that the agency needed to streamline leadership roles to focus on long-term sustainability. Then he delivered the line everyone had been waiting for, without realizing it. Effective immediately, Taylor would no longer be part of the company. The decision had been made after careful consideration, and it was final. The backyard went quiet in a way that felt heavier than any silence I had experienced there before. Forks stopped midway to mouths. My mother's eyes widened. My sister-in-law shifted in her chair and glanced at Brandon as if confirming he had really said it. A couple of the part-time staff exchanged looks, unsure whether to speak. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. The air thickened with that unmistakable mix of shock and awkwardness that follows a public announcement no one saw coming. I sat there for a beat, letting the words settle, then looked up at Brandon and nodded once. "Okay," I said. "I understand. I accept the decision." The reaction rippled through the group almost instantly. Brandon's expression faltered. For the first time, he had clearly expected resistance, an argument, something to justify his prepared responses. My mother's hand moved to her chest. My sister-in-law's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Even the staff seemed caught off guard, as if they had assumed the meeting would end with the usual round of praise for recent wins. No one spoke for several long seconds. I stood up, slowly gathered my notebook and water bottle, and turned toward the gate. "I'll clear my desk on Monday," I added quietly, more for the record than anything else. Then I walked out without another word. Behind me, I could hear the murmurs start, my father's low voice asking Brandon what was going on. My mother's sharper tone saying this wasn't the time or place, but I didn't stop, or turn back. What they didn't know, what no one in that backyard could have guessed, was that I had anticipated this exact moment for months. I had already lined up my next steps, secured independent contracts with several of the clients I had personally brought in, and set up the framework for my own agency. The firing wasn't a surprise. It was the confirmation I needed to move forward without looking back. As I drove away, the weight I had carried for years began to lift, replaced by a quiet certainty that this was the beginning of something entirely my own. The drive home from my parents' house that evening felt longer than usual. The radio stayed off, and the only sound was the hum of tires on the road and the occasional crackle of gravel as I turned onto quieter streets. When I finally walked through my front door, the silence hit harder than any argument could have. I sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the wall, replaying the moment Brandon announced the decision and the way everyone looked at me afterward. It wasn't just the firing that stung. It was the realization that the people who had known me my whole life had chosen to erase my place without hesitation. The next few days blurred into a cycle of doubt and second-guessing. I kept asking myself if I had missed the signs, if I had pushed too hard or stayed too long. Mornings were the worst. I would wake up with the same hollow feeling in my chest, wondering if I had thrown away 8 years for nothing. Bills arrived on schedule, but the paycheck I had counted on didn't. I opened my laptop and stared at the agency email account I no longer had access to, then closed it again, because looking at the client list only made the loss feel more real. Friends texted to check in, but I gave short replies. Explaining the situation out loud made it feel too permanent. I gave myself a week to process before forcing a decision. On the 8th day after the gathering, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started listing what I actually had left. I had the knowledge of how to run campaigns from start to finish. I had relationships with several clients who had reached out privately to say they preferred working with me directly. I had savings that could cover rent and basics for a few months if I stretched them. Most importantly, I had the quiet determination that had carried me through every late night and tough negotiation before. That was enough to start. I registered the new agency under a simple name that felt like a fresh beginning, set up a basic website using templates I already knew, and reached out to the clients who had expressed interest. The first response came quickly, a local developer who had worked with me for years and wanted to continue the same strategy without the overhead of the old agency. That one contract gave me breathing room. I spent the following weeks building everything from scratch: new contracts, new invoicing system, new marketing materials that reflected only my approach. There were nights when I worked until 3 a.m, fueled by coffee and the fear of falling behind. But there were also moments when I caught myself smiling at a finished proposal because it was mine completely. Money was tight at first. I cut back on everything non-essential, ate simple meals, and skipped social events to avoid questions I wasn't ready to answer. The doubt still crept in during quiet hours, questions about whether I could sustain this alone, whether the family fallout would follow me professionally, but each new client or positive feedback chipped away at it. I learned to negotiate rates on my own terms, to trust my instincts without second opinions, and to build a business that didn't depend on anyone's approval but my own. By the end of the first month, I had 3 steady contracts and a pipeline of prospects. The agency was small, but it was growing steadily, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward on my own terms. Several months after launching the agency, the first signs of real momentum appeared. The developer who had been my longest-standing client started referring other contacts in the real estate sector, and within weeks, 2 more firms reached out directly. They explained that they preferred the consistency and attention to detail I had always provided, and they wanted to continue working with me independently. I structured new agreements that reflected the value of those relationships, and the revenue from those 3 clients alone covered overhead and allowed me to hire a part-time assistant for administrative tasks. The agency was still lean, but it was gaining traction steadily. Word spread quickly in the local business community. A boutique hotel chain that had worked with the old agency contacted me after their latest campaign underperformed, asking if I could step in and salvage the strategy I had originally designed. I agreed, revised the plan to fit their updated goals, and within 3 months their bookings increased by 35%. That success led to another referral, then another, until I had a roster of 8 active clients, all of whom had either followed me from the previous company or come through recommendations. The growth wasn't explosive, but it was consistent and sustainable, built on trust and proven results, rather than promises. Meanwhile, the old agency began to feel the absence. The large real estate account that had been my flagship project started slipping. Without the detailed oversight I had provided, deadlines were missed, and revisions piled up until the client quietly reduced their scope. Another chain of restaurants followed suit, citing inconsistent communication and slower turnaround times. Revenue reports that used to show steady upward trends now leveled off, then dipped noticeably. Brandon and Jana scrambled to fill the gaps, bringing in new hires and reallocating responsibilities, but the clients who had relied on my hands-on approach were not easily replaced. My brother tried to downplay the losses in family conversations, claiming the market was simply shifting, but the numbers told a different story. Jana's operations reports showed longer lead times for campaign launches and higher error rates in deliverables. The team morale dipped as workloads increased without corresponding results, and whispers circulated about clients asking why the old lead was no longer involved. Brandon's confidence, usually unshakable, started showing cracks. He began micromanaging staff in ways that frustrated everyone and slowed things further. The tipping point came when the hotel chain officially ended their contract with the old agency and signed with mine full-time. That single move represented a significant portion of their annual revenue, and the loss was impossible to ignore. My parents, who had always deferred to Brandon on operational matters, started asking pointed questions during Sunday dinners about how the agency planned to recover. My mother mentioned in passing that several vendors had inquired about payment delays, a detail that had never come up before. My father remained quieter, but the worry was evident in the way he avoided business talk altogether. I heard about these changes through mutual contacts in the industry rather than direct family communication. The agency I had built was thriving in a way the old one never had, focused, efficient, and free from internal politics. Clients appreciated the direct access and the fact that every decision came from someone who understood their needs intimately. The contrast was stark, and it was becoming clear to everyone involved that the decision made at the family gathering had consequences no one had fully anticipated. About 6 months into running the agency on my own, the calls started. The first one came from Brandon late on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing a campaign brief at my kitchen table. He opened with small talk about the weather, then quickly shifted to the point. The agency was struggling with a couple of key accounts, and they could really use my help to get things back on track. He said it casually, as if it were a simple favor between siblings, but the tone underneath carried an edge of urgency. I listened without interrupting, then told him politely that I was fully committed to my own clients now and couldn't take on additional work. He paused, then switched tactics. "Taylor, we're blood," he said. "This isn't just business, it's family. We've always looked out for each other. You can't just walk away when things get tough." The guilt was unmistakable, layered with the implication that my refusal was a betrayal of everything we had been raised to value. The next evening, my sister-in-law called. Jana started by asking how I was doing, sounding concerned, then moved into how the team was feeling the strain without my experience. "We know you have your own thing now, but the family business is suffering," she said. "It would mean so much if you could come back even part-time. We're all in this together." Her words were softer than Brandon's, but the message was the same. My absence was hurting the people who mattered most. My parents reached out separately a few days later. My mom called first, her voice quieter than usual. She talked about how proud she had always been of my work, how the agency had been our family's legacy, and how hard it was to see it falter. "We need you, Taylor," she said, "not just for the business, but for us. For your father, for Brandon and Jana. We're all feeling the pressure." My dad followed the next morning with a shorter call. He didn't sugarcoat it. Revenue was down significantly. Vendors were pressing for payments, and they were considering difficult decisions about staff. "We raised you to help family," he said plainly. "This is what family does." The pressure built over the following weeks. Brandon texted frequently with updates on lost opportunities and client complaints, always ending with a reminder that "we're family" and "this doesn't have to be permanent." Jana sent longer messages detailing specific projects that were stalling without my input, framing it as a temporary bridge until things stabilized. My mom invited me to dinner, saying it would be good to talk in person, while my dad left voicemails asking if I had thought about the long-term impact on everyone. I responded to each one calmly but firmly. To Brandon, I wrote that I appreciated the concern, but my focus was on the clients I had committed to. To Jana, I explained that my schedule was full and I wasn't available for consulting. To my parents, I said that while I cared about them, returning wasn't an option. Each refusal was clear, direct, and consistent. I didn't raise my voice in any message or call, but I didn't waver either. The guilt trips landed, but they no longer carried the weight they once would have. By the end of the month, the tone shifted from pleading to frustration. Brandon's messages grew shorter, laced with irritation. Jana stopped calling altogether. My mom sounded disappointed in her last voicemail, and my dad simply stopped reaching out. The silence that followed felt heavier than the pressure ever had, but it also confirmed that the decision to stay away was the right one. When the direct pleas stopped working, the tactics changed. A few weeks after the last unanswered voicemail from my mom, the first email arrived in my business inbox. It came from Jana, forwarded from a client I had worked with for years at the old agency. The subject line read, "Concern regarding recent partnership," and the body contained a carefully worded message suggesting that I had left under difficult circumstances and might not be reliable for long-term commitments. The language was subtle phrases like questions about consistency and potential gaps in follow-through. But the intent was clear: to plant doubt without crossing into outright libel. Similar messages followed over the next 10 days. One client forwarded an email chain where Jana referenced past performance issues on projects I had led, implying that my departure had been due to internal concerns. Another received a note from Brandon himself, CC'd to Jana, stating that the agency had restructured for better accountability and recommending caution with any new arrangements involving me. The emails were professional on the surface, but the pattern was unmistakable. They were reaching out to my current and potential clients to undermine trust. I saved everyone, screenshot the timestamps and headers, and organized them into a folder labeled Correspondence. When the volume increased to 5 in a single week, I started recording any phone conversations that involved family members. Tennessee law allows one-party consent for recordings, so I made sure to note the date, time, and context for each one. In one call, Brandon left a voicemail saying he hoped I would reconsider before things got messier. And in another, Jana mentioned in passing that clients were asking questions about my reputation. I documented those too, along with any text messages that arrived outside of business hours. The escalation felt deliberate, designed to force my hand without leaving fingerprints. I spoke with Simone about it over coffee one afternoon, showing her the growing collection of messages. She suggested I consult a lawyer before responding to anything, and she knew someone who specialized in business disputes and defamation cases. I scheduled an initial consultation the following week. The attorney, a woman named Rachel Chen, who had handled similar family business conflicts, listened carefully as I laid out the timeline and shared the files. Rachel explained that the emails and statements could qualify as defamation if they were provably false and caused measurable harm such as lost opportunities or damaged professional standing. She also pointed out the potential for tortious interference with contractual relations since the communications were directed at my existing clients. We discussed building a stronger evidence trail preserving originals without alteration, noting any client feedback that indicated hesitation due to the messages, and continuing to record calls where possible. She advised me to avoid direct confrontation with family members and to respond only through counsel if needed. Over the next month, I followed her guidance precisely. I forwarded suspicious emails to her office, kept a detailed log of interactions, and focused on delivering exceptional work to my clients, so any doubt could be countered by results. The pressure from the old agency didn't stop entirely. There were a few more indirect comments through mutual contacts, but the volume decreased as they realized I wasn't backing down. Rachel reviewed everything and confirmed we had a solid foundation for a claim if the harassment continued. By the end of that period, the folder of evidence had grown substantial. It included timestamps, sender information, exact wording of false claims, and notes on how each communication had affected client relationships. I felt a shift inside, not anger, but resolve. The family I had once trusted had crossed a line, and I was no longer willing to let it slide. With Rachel's help, I was ready to protect what I had built. After the evidence was fully compiled, Rachel filed the initial complaint in civil court. The claim centered on defamation through false statements about my professional reliability and tortious interference with existing business relationships. Within weeks, the response from the old agency arrived, not a counterclaim, but a request to discuss settlement. Brandon and Jana had apparently consulted their own attorney, who quickly realized the strength of the documentation: time-stamped emails, saved voicemails, text logs, and client affidavits confirming the impact on ongoing contracts. The negotiations moved quickly. Rachel represented me, firmly insisting on three main terms: a formal written apology to be sent to every client I had worked with at the old agency, a monetary settlement covering both the economic losses from disrupted relationships and emotional distress from the sustained harassment, and a permanent no-contact agreement backed by a restraining order. The other side pushed back, at first arguing the communications had been private family matters. But the judge assigned to the case reviewed the filings and scheduled an early hearing that made it clear the evidence was compelling. Faced with the likelihood of a public trial and potential punitive damages, they agreed to settle. The final agreement included a payment of $75,000 split between documented economic harm and compensation for emotional distress, and a public apology drafted by Rachel that acknowledged the false statements and their impact on my reputation. The restraining order was granted for 3 years, prohibiting any direct or indirect contact, including through third parties. The order was entered quietly without fanfare, but it carried the full weight of the court. With the legal matter resolved, I made the decision to cut contact completely. I blocked numbers, set email filters, and informed mutual acquaintances that I would no longer discuss family matters. The silence that followed was complete, and for the first time in years it felt like peace rather than absence. My brother and sister-in-law faced immediate consequences. The agency continued to lose ground as more clients quietly shifted their business elsewhere, and internal morale never recovered. My parents, who had once seen the company as their legacy, watched it shrink to a fraction of its former size, eventually selling off assets to stay afloat. The family dynamic that had once felt unbreakable simply dissolved. Meanwhile, the agency I had built grew steadily. I expanded the team to include 2 full-time staff members and began taking on larger projects, including campaigns for nonprofits and small manufacturers that aligned with my values. The work felt meaningful, and the independence allowed me to set boundaries I had never been able to enforce before. Clients appreciated the transparency and consistency, and referrals kept coming in without the shadow of internal politics. A year after the settlement, I started mentoring other women in similar situations. I hosted small workshops in Germantown sharing practical advice on building independent businesses after family conflicts, navigating non-compete issues, and protecting professional reputations. The sessions were informal coffee shop meetups or virtual calls, and they attracted women who had faced the same subtle undermining and favoritism I had experienced. Hearing their stories reminded me how common these patterns are, and helping them felt like turning a painful chapter into something useful. Looking back, the lesson is simple: family ties do not entitle anyone to control or diminish another person's success. When loyalty is demanded at the expense of fairness, it ceases to be love and becomes obligation. Thriving on my own terms became the real answer, not revenge, but peace over the illusion of family unity. I learned that protecting your own path is not selfish, it is necessary. Thank you for listening all the way through this story. It means a lot to know these experiences resonate with so many of you. If any part of this felt familiar, or if you've been through something similar, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and sometimes the support in those conversations is exactly what someone else needs. Take care, and remember, your worth is not defined by the family you were born into, but by the life you choose to build.